Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel is back again. Emancipations podcast. This time I'm very pleased to welcome Jodi Dean to the show. Hello, good morning, Jody. How are you?
I'm great. I'm really happy to be here.
So coming up soon, you will be able to purchase Jodi Dean's brand new book, which I have here, called Capital's Grave, Neo-Feudalism and the New Class Struggle. And we want to have a discussion about this text. As folks have gathered, I don't try to bring authors on and just sort of give them a promotional chance to pitch their book, although that can be a part of our conversation. But I also consider Jodi Dean a colleague. Many moons ago, I interviewed her for a documentary film I was trying to make on Occupy. And she, frankly, Jodi, I mean, you know, you were sort of a muse for me at that moment of the Occupy moment. And for folks who are not aware of Jodi Dean's work, she's a professor of political science in the department at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in New York. She's author of several very, very compelling books. Let me just list like my favorites, and I'll put a link to all of these. I think most definitely it's Crowds and Party, which is my favorite because it was the book where you were the most influenced by Alain Badiou.
Yep, for sure.
And he's a big figure for me, even though lately I have questioned a lot of the presuppositions of Badiou's thought. Although I have a very, very exciting announcement about Badiou that I will just be sharing with comrades later. Then another great book that Jody wrote is called Comrade, an essay on political belonging, which came about, I guess, concurrent to the Trump moment, where we witnessed this sort of profound fracturing internal to the left and the radical left, and this sort of the rise of cancel culture, the rise of all of these polarizing dynamics. But Jody actually is trained in Lacanian psychoanalysis, believe it or not, and has remained as sort of I don't know, like a sort of singular communist voice. And so I really admire your work. And I think a lot of us really look up to your work, in part because a lot of Lacanian scholars get accused of being liberals. And here we have like Jodi Dean. It's like, well, here's an example of one who's not. So, okay, let's jump into the new work. You, along with Yanis Varoufakis, as well as a couple of other scholars, have sort of become known for this neo-feudal thesis. Now, the first thing to note about it is that I think this might be the best way in, is that critical theorists and critical Marxist philosophers have been talking about the idea that capitalism is mutated really since like the monopoly capitalism work, like post-World War II. You see this a lot in French theory. I'm thinking of Jean Baudrillard and his theorizations of neo-capitalism, which was also a concept of Michel Cluscard, even though he's not translated much into English. And then we have the 2008 economic crash, and we have folks talking about post-capitalism, which was Mark Fisher's preferred concept. And so at the cornerstone of the neo-feudal thesis, and correct me if you see it differently, is trying to tether with and work with this idea that something has fundamentally changed in capitalism. On the one hand. On the other hand, what actually does a concept mean for struggle? And like, so I've always seen it as sort of a wager. Like it's both a theoretical concept, but it's also like a concept with the full Marxist understanding that concepts are never purely subtracted from struggle. Right? This is like the thesis on Feuerbach, right? So is that accurate? And can you give us a sort of overview of the genealogy of neo-feudalism?
Okay, thanks for that question and also for the conversation. The one place in the genealogy where I would start and use as more of an anchor point would actually be Lenin on imperialism. Because and even I've been teaching Rosa Luxemburg this last week, and so even Luxemburg, both of them talk about the way, even though they've got differences in their theories of imperialism, but both of them talk about the way that capitalism itself gets to a phase where it is moribund capitalism or dying capitalism. And then they've got different views on what that means. And then where there's a kind of turning in on itself and becoming not quite capitalism anymore. And so we've got like over 100 years of thinking of how capitalism morphs itself, how it changes, how it adapts. And then you gave a periodization, let's say from mid 20th century, about some of that work that's important for let's say extending the monopoly capital thesis that Lenin already was doing in the Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, all the way into, I don't really know this French neo-capitalist work, so I'll kind of pass on that, but into the kind of Mark Fisher and others, the post-capitalist discussion. And so I think the first thing to recognize is that within the Marxist tradition, there has been attunement to the fact that capitalism is not always and everywhere the same, that it can change. And then the question to my mind becomes, does it change and adapt in ways that are always protecting and securing it? Or does it change and adapt in ways that become actually no longer really capitalism? And I think that that's where the debate, one of the axes of debate is right now. So, for example, I share a lot of the same view. There's a lot of overlap between Varoufakis's account of techno-feudalism and my account of neo-feudalism. And there's some places of divergence. One of the places of divergence is Varoufakis says that capitalism is dead. I just think that's a mistake. And I don't think we even need to say that, right? I think we can recognize that capitalism has always been accompanied by other economic forms, by other modes of production. Like, this is why Luxemburg is interesting, because she's interested in how capitalism relies on these other forms. I don't take that up in Capital's Grave, but I am interested in the way that capitalism can actually turn itself into something else. So you can have processes that look the same that start to follow different logics. Right. So this first pass is to answer your question, that something has always been changing in these theories of capitalism, in the understanding of capitalism's, how it works, how it tries to protect itself, what its dynamics can do, and how they can come to contradict themselves. So the first wager on the neo-feudal hypothesis is that capitalism can adapt to such a place that its laws of motion are no longer capitalist. And this is where what my emphasis is on, is that instead of pursuing like the reinvestment of the I'll just say profits for now, kind of sloppily, but the reinvestment of profits, or better, surplus, back into production. Instead of that, we have a capitalist class that essentially eats the proceeds, giving them back into stock dividends and buyouts and this kind of stuff. Instead of being oriented towards improvement, it's blatantly oriented towards destruction. And instead of oriented towards the pursuit of accumulation strategies anchored in production, like making, it's oriented towards taking, towards just absorbing, towards predation, rather than towards production. Brett Christophers uses this, helpful little catchphrase, taking, not making. And that's a feudal dynamic, just taking, just predation, rather than going back into investing this back into some kind of productive economy. So what I'm interested in is how capitalist accumulation strategies have ended up following non-capitalist laws of non-capitalist laws of motion. So I haven't said anything about struggle yet, but maybe we should stop there for a minute in case you want to follow up on those.
Yes. So I think it's important to note that this is not a theoretical argument regarding an understanding of capitalism that is not un-Marxist or breaking from Marx. And I wanted to invite you to say something about the Grundrisse, which, is interesting, because when was it that the Grundrisse was available to scholars? Like some mid 20th century?
Late, right? Like 30s, was it?
30s,
it was in the archives in Moscow.
Correct. Yeah, that is so interesting, because I've done a lot of work on Lukács recently, and the fact that the 1844 manuscripts were also released in the early 30s, concurrent to the rise of fascism,
Yeah.
is very, very interesting to me, because he theorized a form of anti-fascism using the young Marx.
Yeah. Just on the Lukács aside, I almost did my dissertation on Lukács. I was a huge, I was really interested in history and class consciousness and theory of the novel and soul and form. And then all of my advisors were just like, no, you will never, ever get a job. Like, just, no, don't write on Lukács. So I put that aside.
Yeah, well, Jody, I've been at the forefront of Lukács studies, and editing a big journal with HM on his book, The Destruction of Reason.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which, has been, I wouldn't say blacklisted, but let's say it's been ignored as
For
as
sure.
a Stalinist text. And anyways, we brought together some really preeminent Lukácsian scholars to sort of push back against that idea. So stay tuned for that, for those essays. And we did a huge conference on this channel dedicated to destruction of reason. But tell us about how you're theorizing the Neo-Feudal Thesis from a Marxist lens, because I think that a lot of Marxists have a kind of prima facie, or sort of an immediate bad taste in their mouth regarding the whole regarding the whole proposal. That's not really what you are saying. You are saying that Marx already theorizes this, and so can you bring in a little bit of the Grundrisse and how you're bringing this all together?
Okay. So, first thing I want to say is I don't think it's the case a lot of Marxists are kind of skeptical of the thesis. I think Yevgeny Morozov is skeptical of the thesis and pushing his skepticism. But as he liked it before he didn't like it. Like he had some early conversations, some early interviews, maybe with Varoufakis, but I don't remember exactly, where he was not super critical, but he changes his mind. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think people might be questioning, but I'm not sure I share the sense that, people think this is a non-Marxist idea. So that's my just kind of first, what's the general reception? The second thing is, and this is, I'm going to get to your question about the Grundrisse, is I think it's actually also really crucial, and that's why I have this long chapter on kind of temporalities of Marxism, that we have an expansive view of the Marxist tradition that is really mindful of the theorizations that were coming out of Latin America and were coming out of the intercolonial struggles, because they're much more attuned to the overlaps of different economic forms and the ways that capitalist expansion, capitalist development is also at the same time kinds of destruction, de-development, underdevelopment, undevelopment. So that the kind of orthodox Marxist progressivism is not taken as a given. So the first thing I want to urge is that readers, again, even if you don't read the book, as people think about Marx and Marxism, that we got to abandon a kind of linear temporality, and saying that Marxist theory is a theory of stages towards an inevitable triumph. I just think that's incorrect as a reading of the Marxist tradition. And Marx and Engels are all over the place, right? Like, sure, in the rip-rousing Communist Manifesto, they're like, oh, we will proceed from these stages into our glorious future. But in their letters and their later writing, they're much more nuanced about how history will unfold in more twists and turns and backwards and forwards. And it's not always going to be, it's not short-termist, it's not linear, it's not direct. So I want to keep that present. You look like you want to interject.
Well, no, yeah, that's helpful, because you're working with the Grundrisse, but you're also working with a theory of a non-teleological conception
Right.
of the revolution that you're pulling from the Brumaire, the 18th
Right.
Brumaire, which of course is so, I mean, people do Marxist study groups, but you notice that a lot of comrades don't study the Brumaire too much in their Marxist
Yeah.
study. I think they should, right? Because that is the text where the teleological Marx gets complicated.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of work on Engels, and certainly one can make an argument that much of Engels and the Second International had a type of teleological Marxism that was very developmentalist and very progressive oriented in its praxis. So that's helpful, and we're going to get to time and temporality in a moment.
Yeah.
But could we
Back to the Grundrisse.
please?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that's really exciting about the Grundrisse, and I was interested in the parts of the Grundrisse that were also published as, or they're understood as this as separate section on pre-capitalist economic forms, and sometimes called the Foreman, and they tell the story of that capital tells us as an account of the kind of original or originary accumulation, often called just primitive accumulation. They don't tell it simply as this story of violence, of blood and fire. They tell it as a much more gradual story of how a community's productive relations are also reproductive relations, and how these dynamics actually can be logics that will be both growing and consolidating, and also destructing and separating. And this is a long story, right? It takes place it unfolds over a long period of time, these changes in social property relations, the changes in the community, the separation of agricultural labor and artisanal labor, the ways that initial forms of servitude and slavery are within small communities, and then parts of forms of let's say conquest of other communities as communities grow. But it's a long story that's almost like underlying natural processes of combination and separation that are intrinsic to production and reproduction of communities, not capitalists yet, but just in the most abstract way, any kind of human production and reproduction. And what's so interesting is that we see in this kind of long story an account of how freedom and unfreedom are interconnected, and how the workers, as they become free in one sense, are becoming what I would want to call unfree in another sense. They become free to sort of leave their community and sell their labor, but obviously unfree insofar as they don't have their means of subsistence any longer. And one of the things that the Grundrisse then makes us think about is how there's the same set of let's just call them objects or things or relations can start to have different kinds of logics that connect them. And it's that way, that kind of unfolding, and the way the same sets of relations can now start to follow different logics, that I find really important for thinking about how capitalism changes, and how we can see things that might on the one hand look like just capitalist business as usual are actually doing something quite different.
Yes. So that's very helpful. So the idea is that primitive accumulation is not some original event that's like the original sin or original blemish of capitalism, but it's a kind of recurring cycle that affects a sort of huge terrain of social reproductive life, and that this actually subjects the working class in ways that exceed just the tyranny of exploitation vis-a-vis productive labor, because there is a kind of productivist emphasis in classical Marxism, if you want to call it that. And I have the feeling that you're sort of pushing against that, but you're not saying, as some say, like Ernesto Laclau wrote his dissertation, where he effectively argued that the problem of Marxism is that it's basically like class reductionist. And so there's this weird internal debate to Marxism about the working class. And this is like my next question, right?
Yeah.
So like this debate takes a really crazy forms online, where one of the debates, Jody, has been like whether baristas are proletarian, A part of this, Jody, has to do with liberal conceptions of class, because liberal conceptions of class are content to theorize class vis-a-vis education or income. Okay. And so this sort of leaves Marxism in a strange place, because we have this internal debate amongst ourselves that we are divided on to some extent. And so what I want to ask you to talk about is that how you navigate those debates internal to Marxism, and where you think our compass for actual political activity should be in regards to class.
Right. I want to flag Jason E. Smith's book. And now, what is the name of the book? I cite his book. Is it called Automation? Or is that Bernanos? One second. Let me see if I've got it right here.
I love Jason Smith's book. It's called Smart
Machines and Service Work. So
incredible work.
It's a great book. It's really great. And I mean, it's not like I agree with every word, but I learned so much from it. And one of the things I appreciate from Jason's really excellent work here is he draws out a passage from Marx in Capital, where Marx emphasizes how the rise of industrial labor in England was also accompanied by an immense growth in service work and unproductive work, right? A huge growth in the servant class. And this is very interesting. So Marx, so we've got to avoid these reductive readings of Marx that say that the only classes that are there are an industrial proletariat and the bourgeois bosses who are factory owners. Marx had a much more complex view of class than that, and drawing attention to these service workers and how they are in a necessary part of the rise of capitalism, particularly industrial, commodity-producing capitalism. I think I took as a jumping-off point for trying to think more about the service sector. And I'll say I play ridiculously fast and loose with the whole set of elisions between servants, services, service work, servant work, serfs. I just blend those all together, but I do it deliberately. And I do it deliberately because if we can just think back, if we were, thinking in the 1830s or 40s, we would not think industrial working class as a great big unity, as in something generic. We would see all sorts of different activities and forms of work. And it wouldn't even occur to us to say industrial labor force. We'd be like, well, there's the barrel makers, and there's the pin dyers, and here's the people who make wheels for carriages or whatever the hell they're doing, right? So I think that I use the servant work, service work in a blended way to try to get us to think about forms of labor where people have to sell their labor power to survive. And so to that extent, they count as proletarianized labor, but they're not doing productive labor in the sense of commodity production. They're doing services. And so it's this, I think emphasizing services as a crucial part of the contemporary economy, and globally, right? Globally, the majority of people work in services, whether or not it's paid or unpaid labor, particularly once you start throwing in all of the unpaid care work, that's also services. So once you put all of this together, the majority of workers on the planet are not in industrial labor force. The majority of workers on the planet are in services. If that's the case, then what our activism should do is to see this work as the carriers of some kind of aspirational future we want to fight for. So that's actually one of the reasons that one of the things that makes my approach to neo-feudalism different from the techno-feudal thesis is I feel like the techno-feudal guys are not paying enough attention to the majority of workers on the planet as workers.
Right.
They think of everybody as just like consumers and contributors to social media or something, but the majority works in services.
And that's very helpful. And you use the distinction between UBI, which we're all familiar with, and UBS.
Yeah.
And you think that the horizon of political demands, and we should always remember that this conception of political demands was always very important for Lenin. And Lenin gave a very careful class analysis, and he argued that different class positions in capitalism will generate distinctive demands for social change. And that's why he said, to some extent, you know, you need to have a proletarian political organization, because from within the proletariat, you will generate demands, right? So that's why, like, Lenin's theory of demands is not like something from the intellectual cadre down. It's actually meant to be generated from within. So I like this kind of majoritarian approach of service workers. I want to ask you how it differs from Negri. You talk in Negri's theory of multitude. You don't talk about that too much, but perhaps I might invite you to say something about it, in the sense that it seems to me, Jody, Hart and Negri's Empire series has had kind of a limited shelf life in some
For
ways.
sure,
And we
yeah.
should be, as Marx would be, we should be very critical, comradely, very critical. And you are critical of Negri. You're critical about his conception of sovereignty. You're critical about the idea of real subsumption. Perhaps this might help us tease out this question of the subject of the service worker by comparing it to Hart and Negri's theory of the proletariat as a multitude.
Well, I love that question, Daniel. That's really, really interesting. I want to just say a little bit of contextualization and aside, like you said, I've been in my other work pretty critical of Hart and Negri. With Paul Passavant, I edited a book, Empire's New Clothes, reading Hart and Negri right after Empire came back. And I fully agree with you that it was so inspiring around 2000, but it's not worked, right? I think the fact that globalization was just like a ideological appearance of blatant the restructuring of the world in accordance with the interest of U.S. imperialism has made a kind of horizontalist multitude of singularity idea uncompelling. And it's also been uncompelling because of the ways that this multitude was supposed to be able to strike at any point and hurt empire. But that's not true, right? We need organized collectivities. We need militias. We need armies, right? We have to fight a fight. It's not just going to be through this little, small attack here or small attack there. So I think that their multitudinous made it hard or impossible for them to have, say, structuration within the multitude, whether or not it was, religious or racial or classed or political, right? You can't tell within their terms. You don't have political differentiation within this multitude. Nevertheless, and as you mentioned in Capital's Grave, I engage with Negri a lot more. Like it's almost like I moved from my primary interlocutors being Badiou and Zizek, which they were in Crowds and Party, to being Balibar and Negri in Capital's Grave. And I think the reason is that Balibar and Negri were so much more political, right? They're writing adjacent to, critically of, but mentally connected to the communist parties in France and Italy, super critically, but not away from, not just, they're writing in a much more because I'm interested in their writings primarily from the 70s, but not exclusively. And I think that they become really useful in trying to grapple with how a part of the European left was not just taking the banal Euro-communist view, but was trying to hold on to, but basically they were still influenced by Leninism, but critically at a distance. I would almost say like working through in some sort of dramatic ways. Okay,
that comes out very clearly in Balibar's wonderful text on the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yes, it's such a valuable.
It's a masterpiece. It truly really is a masterpiece. I would say it's one of the best Marxist texts of the late 20th century.
That's the book that every book club should be focusing on, right?
Yeah, I did a huge program on it. We read Draper and we read Balibar.
Really? Can I go back and find this in
your
on the website or something?
Yeah, I did it with Comrade C. Derek Varn, and really benefited from it a lot. And you know who else has really helped me on Dictatorship of Proletariat is a wonderful sociologist, Goran Terborn.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because he really talks about, because you were talking just a moment ago about like fighting and like arms, but what I like about Terborn, just as a total aside, please hold your thought, we'll go back,
Yeah.
pardon the digression, is that he says, look, Leninism is founded on a proletariat with arms. And he's like, can we envision a proletariat without arms? And that's sort of been a bit of my vision. I'm not sure, Jody, that a global proletarian movement has the wherewithal to do the type of guerrilla warfare that it did in the 20th century. But that's a total aside. We can debate that at another time, right? Like,
yeah, but let's just stay a little tiny bit though with this aside.
Sure.
I think that the genocide in Palestine demonstrates the necessity of arms, and that any people who cannot or are unwilling to fight back or fight for their freedom will have it taken away. And that it has been a, like, I mean, that doesn't mean use arms everywhere all the time, which would be idiotic, and no armed struggle thinks this. It does mean that the strategic conditions of the effectiveness of particular armed struggles are different from, say, in particular locations of the 70s. But I don't think we should fall in with this kind of pacifistic, moralistic, rejection of armed struggle on the face of it. We've got to just think about it tactically, where and when. Yeah.
Well, that does raise a question I want to get to with you later, which is where we are at, which I just interviewed Jacques Rancière on this program. And I asked Rancière to sort of tell me where we're at with radical democracy. Because, he wrote Hatred of Democracy.
Yeah.
And he was one of the main interlocutors in that radical democracy moment.
Yeah, for sure.
And I want your take on a synopsis of where we're at with that. But maybe we could move back to the class question.
Back to the class question. Actually, I don't remember exactly what the question was. You remind me? Sorry.
So the question was, how is your UBS broad, kind of how is it distinctive or different from the negriist, the Harton Negri multitude conception?
Okay, so the first part is I position service workers directly as a class, right? A class, and the multitude is not a class. And so that means that service workers are within a vision of a divided political. They do not stand for everyone, right? There are enemies. There are other classes to be defeated. And so there's the problem with the whole multitude idea is it's like multitude and empire are two aspects of the same thing. But it's not a class division. So my emphasis on service workers is that they're a class within a fighting structure. The second part is that, and this I think one could have I don't think that the Universal Basic Services, UBS versus UBI, has to, Universal Basic Income has to correlate exactly with multitude versus service sector. I think it could, one could make the alliances differently. So let me just talk a little bit about why I emphasize universal basic services. Two reasons. One, I think universal basic income remains within presumptions of a privatized and commodity economy. It's just you're giving people more money to buy commodities, but you're not installing a planned economy over what production looks like. Universal basic services because it's services, they have to be, they're provided in a universal way. Let's say education, health, housing, transportation, not making it a matter of a commodity or income, but as a general set of provisions. So that requires a fundamental change to the economy in a communist direction, where universal basic income, as everybody knows, has been a capitalist wet dream, right? Like they can continue to have commodity producers out there. So I think I actually find it like shocking that the Italians in that period were, went in the UBI direction. Like that's, to me, like it's never been a very good emancipatory ideal for the working class. But the reason I connect it with the service workers is I'm really thinking, just in the same way that the mid-century Marxists connected the struggle for socialism with the workers' movement. We can connect the struggle for building a new economy on a warming planet with the service sector. Services are provided for the basis of need, right? And that's on the side of the workers. They're not like making, like nursing doesn't produce a commodity. Nursing is caring for basic needs. It's meeting. It's a form of economics that's not profit producing. It's it's needs meeting. From the very beginning, that's been what communism was supposed to be oriented towards. So I think a sector of service workers with UBS as their kind of fundamental demand and horizon actually takes us further towards imagining an economy on a warming planet and the class that can help bring it about.
Very fascinating. So I want to ask about how the traditional working class, which I guess traditional, because you just referenced like Andre Gort's farewell to the working class, right? And they did end up supporting UBI, and they did also part of the New Left. There was this idea that the working class is sort of a dead dog, and that it's about new social movements, and it's about students. So the idea of replacements of the proletariat has been around for a while.
Right, for sure.
So talk to us about how you're thinking and incorporating the more traditional working class, which of course still exists, even though its strategic proximity to the generation of surplus value may have waned in this new neoliberal, neo-feudal era we live in, right? Productive labor is no longer the strategic valve for the overcoming of the system itself. So you're going to put your wager on service. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, now at the same time, it seems to me that the right has managed, through the petty bourgeoisie in particular, to sort of steer that productive labor force in reactionary directions, perhaps in some cases. And so I want to be careful that on the Marxist left, we're not allowing that to continue.
Yeah.
For strategic reasons. I mean, I'm thinking here of the strange sort of Bonapartist Trump coalition founded off of this sort of fusion of like petty bourgeois nostalgia for productive Americana, right? And how the left has tried, but every time they do try to ape that or imitate that, the other side of the left, the ghosts of the new left, will really push back and say, well, if you experiment with productive labor as your class formation base, you're going to be working with reactionaries, and then we get into that whole debate. Have you thought about this? Does this make sense? I'm sort of asking you to speculate on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of different things. In some ways, you could say that my emphasis on the servant sector as the vanguard of class struggle today is part of a fight over the petty bourgeoisie. And to say that, but it's not a fight over the petty bourgeoisie done in national, ethnic, or any kind of identitarian terms. It's a fight over them that emphasizes that they are performing the kinds of labor that will have to be at the core of a global economy that is on a warming planet. And so it's not there's not a backwards looking back like, oh, I really went, miss a bunch of industrial labor force here, blah, blah, blah. It's not that kind of productivist labor vision that fetishizes a white male head of household worker that was always to a certain extent a fantasy. It's not nostalgic for that. In part, not really for PC reasons, but for reasons that on a warming planet, putting our focus on industrial labor is not the best way to go. Of course, there will be agriculture, industrial labor, all these different things, but to think that we need to keep building more factories and employ more people in industrial labor is an error, right? That's just not correct on a warming planet. And So that's just like predictively incorrect. But factually, the majority of people work in services. So we can hold that up and look at that as important rather than denigrate it, disparage it, be sad about it, or whatever. Does that answer what you're asking? I'm not sure if it does.
It does. A lot of new Marxist research and scholarship that we have looked at in my community here has turned our attention to China and turned our attention to this idea that in the West, Marxism, I'm thinking here of the work of Domenico Lacerdo,
Yeah.
has had a kind of allergy to this idea of the classical Marxist demand for seizing the means of production and thinking power in such ways. And I felt like while I see and I appreciate the big umbrella that you're pulling forward, and it makes a lot of strategic sense, and we can talk about democracy and how we're going to use the institutions to achieve some of those goals in a moment, it also just makes me wonder, like, if we're thinking what a socialist, how a socialist party can include some of those include sort of like, yeah, the fight with the petty bourgeoisie, right, is sort of the nexus of this, whereby we're not making claims that I think liberals are comfortable to make, which is that appeals to strengthening productive labor are risk being reactionary or something like that, and then you get into this kind of culturalist PC debate, which I really think we should avoid.
Totally.
So I don't know if that fully answers my question, like, about,
So
because you are definitely saying that, like, you're sort of, and even in the examples you give of the teacher strike of 2019, right, you're saying these are the kinds of struggles that will actually produce something real, right? Where is productive based struggles? Like, what's the union movement? Like, where's all of that fit into this?
so
Yeah.
I mean, where are we seeing a lot of progress in the union movement these days? Amazon, Starbucks, right? These have been places that graduate students, temporary faculty. I mean, maybe that's just that my world, but we are not seeing huge developments on the kind of classical industrial labor side. We're seeing more unionization of service workers. That's exciting. Right? That actually would be that would be in keeping with the logic that I'm emphasizing. I also want to make sure, Daniel, that we don't engage too much, that we don't exclusively focus on working class struggles as struggles at the workplace. Because cost of living struggles, environmental struggles, struggles around healthcare, struggles around transportation, all of those are also class struggles, right? Like the ruling class doesn't need to go into the streets or mobilize people for their side on this, but we do, and those are forms of class struggle. So we got to always keep in mind class struggle is not just workplace struggle. The other thing that I wanted to add in is, like, look, I think we would all agree, and this your mention of Gort's is what made me think of this. For at least the last 40 years, the left, many on the left have said things like, no, the working class is dead. Nobody wants to think of themselves as a worker. Badiou is interesting on this, right? Like, the worker is not a figure for collective organizing anymore. It's collapsed as that. And what I'm trying to offer is another figure of the worker, not of everyone, not of the multitude, not like, oh, anybody could fit into this, but like, actually, we have, economically speaking and politically speaking, a whole sector of global society in services. And that if this sector can recognize itself as carrying a future for the planet, then they can fight for that future.
I love that. Thank you for that. So we don't need to somehow abandon the Marxist sort of the central kind of historical materialist claim of the abolition of classes, right? Because in Hearts and Negri, it's kind of unclear if there even are classes, right? So it's kind of, well, what are we doing, right? And then we're sort of indistinguishable from liberalism, and that's fine according to them. So you get this kind of non-antagonistic Marxism. And so I very much appreciate that clarification. I want to shift to a consideration about the Neo-Feudal thesis in culture. I did a couple programs on this because I'm very taken with your whole project, and I did a little bit of like thinking this through, and I want to see if you have also thought about it. You maybe have written about it. Like I've identified these motifs in like Succession, the
Yeah.
popular HBO series. I've identified them in Ozark on Netflix, and even in Breaking Bad. And what I mean is like the end of competition, right? This idea that social mobility is over, and that in order, like the heroes in these sort of three shows that I just mentioned, have to accumulate such massive amounts of capital, pure just money. But did you notice, like, say, even in Ozark, no one's social mobility changes, no one's
Mhm.
class position changes. Even when the hillbillies become millionaires, they're still hillbillies. So that whole progressivist, like algerist, liberal idea of mobility is kind of dead. And so
Yeah.
like I feel like that has painful reverberations throughout our culture. And it's like you know what I mean? And like these shows kind of portray that difficulty. Even I would say leisure. Like how is
Mhm.
leisure portrayed? Keeping up with the Kardashians and so on. There's kind of like this feudal idea of pure exemption from labor. Can you talk about the pop culture effects of the Neo-Feudal Thesis?
Um, I really love the way you've set this up. I didn't do, as you know, in the book, I didn't do a whole lot on popular culture, and I kind of don't know why I didn't. Other than this book took me like a really long time to write, compared to say Comrade or Crowds and Party, and I just like wanted to get it off my desk and get the. I also wanted to get the idea out there. And then I was also reluctant to write much about culture because I felt like culture is so fragmented these days that I couldn't find cultural artifacts that would speak broadly enough. And so, fortunately, I watch the same stuff you watch, and so I'm really happy with those examples. I did think a little bit about Game of Thrones because Game of Thrones just seems like the largest scale version of a neo-feudal world, and it's one like that people immediately were absorbed, that audiences were immediately absorbed into, could really recognize, I think, not this as a fantasy but as a model for, yes, it's a non-capitalist world. People, there is debt, there are armies, and there's machinations within families. One of the things that's also so interesting to me about your throwing in Cardassians with Succession is how both of those are family dramas, right? One so-called real and the other one not. But all of the action is about what happens in a family. The conflict isn't, like you said, it's not class conflict, it's internal familial conflict, which is a completely feudal idea. One of the things I was saying is like, people want to talk about the personal as political. That's feudalism, right? That's not second wave feminism, though, of course, second wave feminists did a lot with that slogan. But really, the kind of originary version of the personal being political are forms of feudalism where all power relies on, who is your family and how strong is your family, and is your family on top, and can your family control other families. And I also think we notice people pay an inordinate amount of attention to Trump's family and to all of the different, really, which son is on top, how, which son is the heir. And I mean, maybe in part because he does have too much of a kind of nepotistic familial approach to power, but it's interesting as a kind of way that our world is folding into something that's not recognizably the modernist country of the mid 20th century, but something that looks more like feudalism.
Yeah, I mean, it is a point that Jacques Lacan makes in his 17th seminar, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, which I write about in one of my books, which is he has this idea of what he calls the luck of the aristocracy. And he says that like modernity has destabilized this idea. And so there was a moment in the feudal period, according to Lacan, where you had this kind of dispensation of one's proper name in a kind of careful order of honor. And he talks a lot about how shame, the affect of shame,
Mm.
was well placed. So like if you were ashamed in the feudal period, according to Lacan, like it would have like true effects. It would like, you know, like you never, not only do you not want to be ashamed in feudalism, but you don't want your master to be ashamed. And that's why Lacan talks all the time in that seminar, you may remember, about how modern life has totally eroded that, and we have a shamelessness in some sense. But what's interesting about that is there is this nostalgia for a kind of return to a culture in which shame was stabilized in some sense, but like we can't, but capitalism prevents us from realizing that. That's a little bit of a side point. Sorry.
Oh, but I think this is really, really interesting and important because it's you know, as your correct point to Lacan on the role of honor and shame into traditional notions of European feudalism is not at all what we have under contemporary neo-feudalism. There is a shamelessness, and it's so instead of, I mean, it really, the more powerful someone is in our system, the less shame they need to have. And part of me actually wonders that if we, you know, if we, that we could, I bet we can find instances in, you know, the real existing European feudalism where power is also associated with a kind of shamelessness, that it's not like, yes, of course there are codes of honor, but those really matter for vassals, right? They really matter for people trying to get close to power, less than people who really seem to have it. And the less stable a particular monarchy is, the more shame comes into play. But these days we have power that commands that folks kiss the ring, bend the knee, and it's also shameless. I mean, wasn't it kind of shocking how quickly the mainstream media and mainstream commentary resorted to feudal metaphors after Trump won? Right? They really were talking about, you know, the different tech lords going out and, you know, going and bending the knee in Mar-a-Lago. I mean, they folded into thinking about U.S. politics in a neo-feudal way. They talked about Trump's ascension as if rather than election. It's really quite amazing.
This is the sort of startling thing about the return of neo-aristocratic thought, and I'm writing about this. Like Yarvin Yarvin is like, look, FDR in his recent interview with the New York Times, FDR was basically like an American aristocrat who's like a kind of quasi monarch, right? And he did these kind of dictatorial moves to sort of save capitalism, and like liberals conveniently ignore that fact, right? But he's like, but this is actually how our society should be structured, around these monarchical figures that have this kind of sovereign wherewithal. And I wanted to invite you to talk maybe a little bit about sovereignty and power, and in that regard, because you talk a lot about how sovereignty is totally mutated today. And one other thing I wanted to say about that, by the way, is that, you know, a lot of 19th century liberals did make a détente, including Ferdinand Lassalle, which Marx disagreed with. Because what did Lassalle say during the class struggles period right after 1848? So the workers are losing, we can make a détente with the aristocracy. Basically, they can funnel money to us, right? For the workers' movement, for their liberation. And Marx, in short, disagrees with that idea. He doesn't think that solidarity is a useful one. I recently had a figure on my show who's saying that, well, if the left socialist party in America really wants to succeed, we need to find a sugar daddy oligarch who will kind of pump money to do an electoral campaign for us, right? After like Citizens United, for example. I want to get your thoughts on that. Oligarchy, sovereignty, and this weird fetish. Like, what's up with all of that?
So on the one hand, the weird fetish is just coming out of the reality of money in U.S. politics, right? It's just like there's like a material reason for that. Where are we going to get the money? But I think the mistake is to think that socialists should focus on elections, right? We need money, but not to win elections. So that would be that last part on sovereignty. So one of the things that I don't know how much it comes out in the book, but I've been for like, I don't know, at least a decade, I've been really irritated by a particular kind of not necessarily a Marxist writing at all, but a humanities, lefty, posty, vibey, anti-sovereignty kind of writing. And I associate it with, I mean, Lauren Berlant, who's great and a genius and wonderful, may they rest in peace. Lauren Berlant has some of these gestures to the problem of sovereignty as just things to get away from. Judith Butler sometimes rejects sovereignty. There's a kind of posty rejection of sovereignty as the locus of a problem, rather than recognizing actually there has been a complete erosion of anything like the sovereignty of the people, which had been the basis of democracy at the end of the 19th century and throughout the middle of the 20th century, that under say neoliberalism, sovereignty of the people has not, it's been eroded, it's been privatized, it's been rejected as no longer valuable. A lot of the struggle around democracy, and we can come back to that, but is in part symptomatic of a holy crap, we've lost sovereignty of the people, we need to have it back. But this anti-sovereignty business acts as if sovereignty is a form of power that we don't need. Actually, Susan Button Morris, in a book I absolutely love, Dream World and Catastrophe, also treats sovereignty as a problem rather than sovereignty as something that we don't have and need to have. And so part of my criticism of Negri is that his hope was that the end of sovereignty would be an expansion of, let's say, forms of working class, popular, or multitudinous freedom, rather than the form of its absence. And what I see is that sovereignty has become suzerainty, which it would be like the computing fiefdoms, right? Forms of capitalist power, momentary kinds of state power, the sort of free zones that Quinn Slobodian talks about, right? Free trade zones and all these different zones where state power has given itself up to capitalists, even in a territorial way, which is a little bit shocking, right? No one in the 18th century would have said, oh, a powerful state's now going to just retreat and give its power of taxation and regulation or whatever it's going to do over to some kind of private firm. They would think that's nuts, but that's business as usual in the 21st century. So my argument is that sovereignty is not the big danger to be eliminated. Sovereignty has been lost, and what we need is essentially the political power of the working class as a sovereign form of power. And that the worries around the loss of the worries around sovereignty are really more symptomatic of its loss and its transformation into these different kinds of suzerainty.
Okay, so that's helpful, because one of the parts that I found interesting in your book was your conversation regarding Silvia Federici and the notion of the commons.
Yeah.
It was just related to this in some extent. And I was thinking even of work from the kind of California Marxist school that I always benefit from, Jasper Burns and Joshua Clover and their work on the commune. And you push against some of these ideas of the commons. And I want to invite you to say something about that, perhaps, because, we did have that moment, which was very influenced by like the Sandinistas, and this idea of like co-ops and even like
the Zapatistas, really.
Yeah, what did I say?
You said Sandinistas.
Oh, did I say Sorry, Zapatistas. Yeah. My bad. But even like Eric Olin, right, talked a lot about co-ops. And I know I'm asking you to
take on the state, right? All of these sort of lovely forms of localist provisioning might be adaptive and survival methods, but they don't take on the state, so they don't take on the actual conditions in which they persist.
So how do we take on the state, if you could? Like, that's the heart of my question there.
Oh, yeah, that requires organized political party, like the party form that I argue for in Crowds and Party. And I'm hoping that recognizing that we can have a form of class mobilization around service workers that can help us actually build a force that could take on the state.
And your conception of the party is very much in Crowds and Party is very much influenced by Badiou, but Badiou himself, his conception of the party is itself, maybe you could say, very post-Maoist and very not idiosyncratic, but it's very different perhaps than an intuitive idea of what we think about like a Marxist or socialist party. Could you maybe just briefly sketch what you mean by the party.
My students call it Jody's imaginary party. Right, like they're just like, what are you talking about? Basically what I have in mind is the fantasy that the Communist Party had of itself, and that the people around it also had of the Communist Party as a actual party of the workers, capable of great things, capable of taking on the ruling class and winning. And so there is a degree of aspiration, but I think any organization has this symbolic and imaginary dimension to it, right? It's kind of aspirational quality, the sets of ideals and potentialities that it mobilizes in order to have some kind of capacity. So the one little bit of overlap, I think, with Badiou is like he recognizes the party as a body for the idea, and that the party is a form of working out of the idea in practice. He just doesn't have, in my view, I mean, I'm sure you know this literature much better than I do, but it seems like Badiou just thinks that as things worked themselves out historically, the real existing historical communist parties failed in that, and that time is over now. And I think the fact that they may have, I wouldn't accept the judgment that of it failure, and then I also wouldn't say even if it was defeated, or that it's over, that you try again, fail again, try again, fail again.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, Assad Haider and Viewpoint Magazine are very good, as well as Sylvain Lazarus, on this post-Maoist conjuncture. One of the interesting things, though, about a lot of their work on the party is sort of the presupposition that neoliberalism has prevented communists from generating things like the mass line. So there is that abandonment of some of those strategies of mass politics, right? It's definitely not interested in parliamentary politics at all. So it does lend itself, like if you look at Communism and Strategy by Isabel Garo, she criticizes Badiou, right, as effectively practicing the localism that he abhorred.
Yeah, that's a good argument. It's a good argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talked about culture. We've talked. So could we? Let me throw this question in there, Jody, which is, Mackenzie Wark says this is something worse than capitalism, and that is a provocation, which means that has effects, like I said at the very beginning, on our imagination about how to move beyond capitalism. And so there is that kind of question there, which takes us back to the class question in a curious way, because like if Lenin and Marx are right that people relate to capitalism through their class position, what does that mean? Because it could mean, right, that at a rhetorical level, if people actually think that we are in something worse than capitalism, how are they not going to demand that we go back to a better capitalism?
Yeah.
Right? This is like the heart of a conundrum, right? This is like, that's a big question.
Totally. That's really crucial. I'm so glad you asked this. Because in part, I started working on this book because of Mackenzie Wark's, Capitalism is Dead, which I thought was like crazy. Like not the book, like when I first saw her doing some like tweets or social media posts, and I'm just like, this cannot be true. This is ridiculous. This is just an avant-garde gesture, for crying out loud. And then it like ate at me like some sort of brain worm for like 2 years, and until it was just like, damn, I think she might have something here. And what might it help? How might it free me in, mentally, to imagine forms of action and possibility if I accept the thesis? So that was my first move into this, was what happens if we take it seriously? And I felt like it was really expansive and less entrapping than assuming that things were just business as usual and we were still in capitalism. But then I read a couple of books by, oh my God, Joel Kotkin, who's this right-wing California guy, and he's got a book on neo-feudalism and another one on class struggle. And he uses the neo-feudal idea to attack like the Hollywood, academia, green clergy or clerisy. And so it's
Kind
a
of like
totally right.
taking the Ehrenreich thesis, but using it on the right.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And one of the reasons that he's doing this is to try to galvanize support for a kind of vision of mid 20th century American capitalism, right? Gas guzzling vehicles, no regulation, right? And that's what's going to be necessary to defeat neo-feudalism.
Well, that's kind of what Vance is saying. When
Yeah,
JD
totally.
Vance just said, Nixon said the professors are the enemy, and he was right. The professors are the enemy. But when he said that recently, I don't know if you saw the news conference, I kind of felt like he's faking it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is
Yeah.
bullshit. Like, it's just such a pandering thing. But you're right. So what you're saying is that the right can easily take the neo-feudal thesis. So how are you going to
Yeah, so my claim is that
protect it?
actually, once you say that capitalism is doing that to itself, that it's capital's own dynamics, that it's basically, you use a solid Marxist materialist analysis of capital as a system that follows particular laws of motion. It can change these laws of motion. These laws of motion can come into contradiction with themselves, which is my argument. But you're not saying that one group of people is doing anything. You're just saying, holy crap, look at what accumulation strategies, they've become accumulation is disconnected from production. Right, that's crucial. And the problem with a thesis like what's his face, Kotkins, is he assumes that there's people pulling the strings, not that there's a system that's changing itself into something else. And once you have that argument, then you can tell people, guess what, we can't, there's no going back. We can't just put in place, like, we live in a world that is interconnected economically. We can't go back. We've got to keep going forward. And what does going forward mean? Actually, you people who are listening to this, you are the ones who are pushing it forward, because the forward is going to come from services and service work. We can't go backwards and just pretend that we can reinstall a 20th century version of capitalism. So that's why I think that wins.
Yeah, it's anti-system, not necessarily. The locus is not anti-elitism, which I think is because
That's
Marx,
the populist thing.
Yeah, it's not left populism, right?
Yeah.
You're not advocating left populism, which is very very helpful. Well,
down with left populism. There's actually really no such thing. It's all populism is right, in my view, because it denies cost.
So I remember the Bernie moment, obviously, and it was tragic in many ways. It was also very hopeful, and he did open a lot of spaces on the left, but he also, as I see it, kind of came at the tail end of this moment of radical, what I want to turn to now is radical democracy and where we're at with that. One of the most startling moments was, of course, what happened with Syriza in Greece, where this intervention occurred, where it just felt to me like, talk about sovereignty, right? Like, this is kind of just like, here, like, you will know who's boss now. And that was really like a warning for the future. And as to the limits of radical democracy, right? And so were Corbyn and Sanders, for that matter. But they helped our political imaginary at the same time. I don't want to totally defame them or anything like that. But how would you give a sort of balance sheet, perhaps, on radical democracy, and sort of like what were some of its presuppositions that maybe were flawed for you?
I think that the whole framework of radical democracy, and I'm thinking primarily of Leclau and Mouffe, but not exclusively, but the moment that they set off or inspired, it was primarily a rejection of class and communism. That to me has always been the problem with the radical democracy thesis, is it approaches people as citizens rather than members of class. It assumes an equality among citizens rather than class division. And it makes democracy a horizon for politics rather than communism as being the horizon. Because of this, it emphasizes political forms of association while letting the economy remain. So radical democracy was actually symptomatic of neoliberalism's takeover of the economy. right? As a logic of the economy, rather than continuing to fight for a communist or even socialist approach to the economy that had to be regulated. So I think that the whole radical democracy moment was a symptom of failure and a try to effacement of that failure. Yeah, I mean, at the very least, it kept democracy from becoming only a dirty word, and that's a good thing. But I don't have a whole lot positive to say about that moment, because I really thought of it as part of the ongoing rejection of communism since 1989 to 92. That it was just that push.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. And of course, Occupy came almost like the crescendo of that expression in
Yeah,
some ways. So it is curious and interesting to see how far we have come since then. Um, and in some ways very productive, because Marxism is like about learning, right? Learning politics, right? So we are learning as we go, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. I want to now shift to psychoanalysis. There is a sort of psychoanalytic thing you do in the book about anxiety, and I want to invite you to say something about that. We talked about shame, um, but you talk a lot about anxiety, and you identify it as, I think, the fourth sort of node of the neo-feudal horizon, right? And
yeah,
it's so what is this idea? And you say that we live in a world where one of the predominant ideological positions is that nobody cares.
right.
And it's I had a sense, Jody, of a profound sadness, as a father, just like reading this, just like this is tough stuff, man. This is, you know what I mean? Like, and it's true though. And it's like it's so depoliticizing. But it's also like, how do you take the sadness that comes from that general idea and actually turn it into struggle, into a willingness to fight? I think that's the question.
Yeah,
So how do you actually take this resignation? Because the first thing you would want is to resign and say, yeah, nobody's in charge, parcellated sovereignty. We check in, we check out, we play some video games in between. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll be able to participate a little bit in what they used to tell us was the American dream. Maybe. So it's a very difficult part of the book, frankly, for me, if you actually sit and contemplate like what that means for the future, for our
yeah.
children. Like it's difficult stuff. But can you tell us about this part of your book? Lay it out.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I present neo-feudalism in terms of kind of as a general structure that has like four components, right? So or a general framework with four components, and that is the kind of parcelization of sovereignty or fragmentation. It's a new lords and serfs, or kind of the class relations, or you can call them, social relations of production. I talk about hinterlands or hinterlandization, which would be like the landscape or spatialization. And I talk about a kind of the spread of a generalized kind of psychosis or anxiety or catastrophism. It's really like the affective layer of neo-feudalism. So rather than specifically talking about cultural artifacts or cultural products, I try to basically have a vibe discussion, and this vibe of real anxiety, catastrophism, you associate it, I think, rightly with resignation. There's kind of sadness, there's misery. Psychoanalytically, for me, what was important about it is that it corresponds to the decline of the symbolic, or the collapse of symbolic efficiency. So there's not a symbolic order that people occupy that tells them, okay, this is how you can see yourself as being a meaningful and valuable person. So, like, they're back in some version in the mid 20th century, to be a professor was to be a kind of valued member and respected, knowledgeable person. Now to be a professor is basically to be a precarious, contingent, much derided and despised member of the petite bourgeoisie, right? The same doctors, instead of being sort of noble people, highly regarded or friends of the community, now they are people who see folks at 15 minutes at a time while looking at a screen and are part of a much hated pharmaceutical, medical, industrial complex. So the symbolic order that gave us a sense of purpose and meaning is gone. And then that means also the order that said, hey, people care about this, isn't really there anymore. It's like, as soon as, and we express this all the time, right? Once you start to look at it, you start to see in newspaper articles, everyday conversation, online, people will use the catchphrase, oh, nobody cares about X or nobody cares about Y, as almost always as a way of saying, hey, I really care about this. but in fact, nobody does. And nobody does. The sense is that care can't register. It's not enough because of this generalized decline of symbolic efficiency or decline of symbolic order, or we could say a decline of sovereignty. These are all layers or facets of the same general phenomenon. And it's very difficult under these settings to actually give anyone or have a sense like actually people care about that. So what do? I actually think the solution is, not surprisingly, and yet again, the party, the Communist Party, as a locus of meaning, narrative, capacity that is some, like, nobody would say that the Communist Party doesn't care about workers, right? Even in just this fantastic vision, this like not real vision, but people think of socialist and communist parties as actually a registry, as place where some version of something like, yes, they do care about X. The communists care about the oppressed, right? The communists care about workers. So I think that just at that idealistic level, the party helps address this, but also more importantly, practical level, when people are engaged in meaningful practical politics that can start to assuage the idea that nobody cares, because you're working every day in a collective that actually cares. So I would say that no one in my party would have ever said nobody cares about Palestine, right? Because every day some of us were on the street. Every week, all of us were on the street, deeply engaged in the struggle against the genocide and the occupation. So it's a profound aspect of our present, but it's also a combatable one through organized political struggle.
It's really powerful. I mean, it reminds me of this idea that civil society, like, people need to be ready for or primed for socialist ideas. So this idea that the party can be an engine for reinforcing a sort of a worldview of care in a bourgeois public sphere, which has already abandoned those commitments.
Yeah.
So it's also like a public, like, I love that thing from queer theory of counterpublics.
Yeah.
Like a socialist communist party being a counterpublic. And also the materialist argument that if service workers are at the vanguard, much of the service work industry is care work. So it's also like a little like materialist. I mean, that may not like be translated to this like symbolic like meaning, but like in a material sense, that's actually what actually is going on. And of course, that labor is like totally unvalorized and totally dejected and not really like celebrated or praised, right, at all. And that
I want just say one thing. Like I'm a little hesitant regarding in general the language of public and publics as well as civil society. I think all of that bunch of work, Habermas's structural transformation the public sphere wasn't translated in English until 1989. And that was part of the reappearance of that book was part of the takeoff of ideas of publics and counterpublics from Michael Warner, also is influenced by Habermas there. I think we need to put that in the context of the retreat and abandonment of communism and class struggle, right? The whole idea of publics rather than class. And so when I think about the party, I'm really wanting, and maybe I should have said this earlier or more directly, think like the Communist Party is an organized party for the working class, right? It's not claiming to be a public in the sense of, all inclusive. It's supposed to embody the emancipatory egalitarian energies of the producers in order to bring down a system that exploits them. And I don't think that's the same as a public.
I can see that. I suppose at the same time, doesn't there need to be concurrent to party work, educational work, cultural development? I mean, like, this is why,
Totally.
like, studying the cultural civil society work that happened during the Second International period is very, very important, I think, right? That, and I would characterize some of that. A counterpublic is not like subtracted from the bourgeois public. It's in contestation. It's an antagonistic. I've been writing a lot about this.
Yeah, but is it a class based? Is it understood in terms of class? Like what kind of I think I'm concerned about the ways that the concept starts to steer or push thinking away from class and the economy. That like because it's been the case, as you rightly say, that socialist and communist organizations always had an educational dimension, but that's not the same idiom as the idiom of publics and citizens.
Well, I'm just thinking of the 1844 manuscripts, right, where Marx talks about like the sensuality of worker associations, and he talks about the importance of building. Like he actually says, and this is something that I think a lot of Marxist writers have chastised Marx for saying, he said, at some point, self-esteem is more important than bread. Precisely because of the degradation of a particular form of, he's very much working on an immiseration thesis of the proletariat, which I don't submit to that. But what I'm saying is that I do think that in order for a class struggle to have like consciousness, we do need to have vectors whereby people can kind of latch in and connect to a type of community building initiative or project that would be capable of creating a kind of shared worldview. And that shared worldview would be capable then of contesting the dominant public. We don't have any of the resources the dominant public does. But otherwise, I feel that it's a question of like a pure capture by liberal institutions of class antagonistic energies. So I would still want to retain something like a notion of counterpublic. Otherwise, like I just don't see how socialist education could really get off the ground. Maybe it's a question about like mediation and antagonism with existing liberal institutions, which I think is a big barrier. Wouldn't you agree? Wouldn't you agree that? But no,
I feel like there's a loss in saying that we're doing public education and not working class education.
I see.
That we're
I see.
reaching out to the public rather than strengthening our class.
Fair. That actually is a semantical point that I would fully actually want to incorporate and modify. So I agree with you on that. So I guess in closing, Jody, I want to say sort of like ask you a bigger question about where you want this conversation to go, right? Like how have you thought about that? Like what type of debates would you like to see emerge from this? Because your thesis is quite provocative. And as you say, you also have kind of like contenders on the right that are also using something
Yeah.
similar. And I've always been concerned about that, sort of this idea of like how a concept can achieve the ends that you want. So what sort of things do you want to come from this?
Yeah.
Because in some sense, it's very much a clarion call of a type of for furthering a type of class radicalism, right? So that seems to be very clear to me. And I feel that also is, yeah, that's an experimental wager. You are wanting to do that. And so bravo for that. So like maybe how do you see that going, and what do you want to achieve with this? Like how, other than like, you know, doing reading groups on this text and other things and debates and discussions, like what more
Yeah,
would you like to see come of this?
so one, I love the questions that you've posed and pushed, and particularly what I want is the left to have an up to date, invigorated, and inspiring account of the working class, and I think that recognizing the service workers as that class that can usher in the fight for a glorious future on a warming planet, a new vanguard. I think that's important. I think that the left has been losing because we don't have an inspiring account of class. That it's tended to collapse into these outmoded productivist notions, workerist notions that don't correspond to the majority of workers on the planet, and that this can be much more useful. So that's my ideal. I want to say also that one of the things that I so have appreciated about your questions, Daniel, like so comradely, is that you didn't say anything like, well, I kind of like your idea, but couldn't you have a better name? It's so old fashioned. Like, why go backwards? Because I get this all the time. Like, yeah, I agree with you, but why didn't you have, like, this is actually what McKinsey Work says. It's like, why not vectorless class? Like, stop with these backward looking things. And you didn't go into that, like the labeling issue, like, yeah, you might be onto something, but the label is stupid. And the thing is that one of the reasons that I went with this label or term, I would want to say concept or potential proto concept, is that it's coming actually out of real existing class struggles, like the struggle in California around Deliveroo and Uber and Lyft, right? People who are organizing the workers to vote against, was it Prop 22? Prop 20, I get the numbers wrong. Prop 22?
22.
Yeah, 22.
So,
They
yeah.
say in the rallies, it's fucking feudalism all over again, right? It's in the air that the loss of freedom that people experience feels like a new kind of serfdom. So it's not like I'm just finding some old term and trying to turn it into jargon. It's that it's coming up from from real existing struggles and experiences.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad that you didn't and like, in fact, your cultural references made it clear that, like, you see that part of it, even if you disagree with other elements.
Yeah.
It seems like you recognize the resonance.
Well, I find it very interesting because as a side point, like, you know, the Bolsheviks were in some sense fighting an ancien regime, as were the Jacobins. And so there is like sort of like a kind of project that could be done based on your work, just to ask. And this actually is where like Nietzsche comes into play big time. Like the first book that was a left Nietzschean book is by a figure by the name of Kurt Eisner. And when Max Weber wrote about this concept that he had of the charismatic personality, he was thinking of Kurt Eisner. And Kurt Eisner wrote this book right before Nietzsche died. This will connect to the thing, don't worry, where he argued that Nietzsche is the most important thinker for socialism, because Nietzsche helps the working class understand how to become aristocrats and then overcome that, overcome it. It's called Spiritual Psychopathy, Nietzsche, the Apostle of the Future. And he actually led the Bavarian Socialist Revolution of 1918. So it's a very interesting idea of like how, you know, if we are becoming neo-feudal, what actually does that mean? In some sense, it grants further legitimacy to an absolutely revolutionary position.
Yes.
In a way, right?
100% right.
Right. And it's just so interesting that so many liberals, like even when you listen to NPR, did you ever notice that liberals are now dissociating their tradition from like Robespierre, right? Right. From revolution. So it's like, that's very curious to me. It's like more work could be done about like the signifier of feudalism and like revolutionary fervor in some ways, right? So in that sense, it may be rhetorically or at least discourse works. Final question, which is kind of an encore question. A lot of Marxist comrades think that Jacques Lacan is sort of unhelpful for Marxism. And I've always wanted to maybe ask you this question. What would you say to that, right? Like, I have to defend Lacan, right? And you know, it's not easy in the sense that he was no Marxist himself, so I'm not making that claim, right?
Right. Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, of course. But some people do wonder that. They think like, well, the only psychoanalyst you should use would be the Marxist one, like Reich. Or like, well, no, it actually doesn't work that way. So this is a little far afield, Jody, but perhaps maybe related. And maybe I'll put this on like the Patreon special. What would you say to like why Lacan? Why would Lacan help us think class struggle, things like that?
I've got I think two answers. The first one is more abstract, and that is I think both Marxism and psychoanalysis can risk being closed systems, closed discourses that have single lines of explanation, and that together they hold open the spaces for thought and action within each other. And so that they're much stronger together because basically their gaps overlap, right? So they can, and that prevents them. You can hold open the gaps within them that they risk closing off, and that kind of overlap of two lacks, it would be the kind of Hegelian position of the subject, and that together they are much stronger. So just as theoretical worlds. And then I think that so that's the abstract answer. The practical answer is ideology is a real problem, and how people ideologically respond to and are produced by their settings needs attention. And that's not where Marxists, that's not the skill set of the Marxist tradition by itself. It is the skill set of psychoanalysis to try to get us a better understanding of the kind of failed, pathetic subjects that we are and the horrible conditions we encounter, and what are the different structures that we that configure us.
Beautiful. Well, Jody, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, this is great.
Really enjoyed it, and hopefully have you back again. We wish you the best of luck with this book. It's really good, and I'm excited for it to come out March. So what is it coming out in March? Sometime
I think
in March.
so. I don't know. End of February, beginning of March. I think the official date's March, something in March, but I don't know.
Thanks for coming on, and wish you all the best. Thanks everybody for listening.